Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. In this third episode of our Witches, Cunning Folk and Magic theme, I'm talking to Deborah Hyde, an author, presenter and producer who has written for periodicals such as The Guardian and the Fortean Times, and who specialises in the subject of weird belief. For 10 years, Deborah was Editor-in-Chief of The Skeptic and is a Fellow of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. She makes frequent TV appearances, being a regular contributor to Strange Evidence and Mysteries at the Museum, and has presented insights in some of BBC iPlayer's most successful recent podcasts, such as Uncanny, the Battersea Poltergeist and Lady Swindlers. In this chat, we talk about Margery Jourdemayne as an example of a cunning woman caught up in royal politics, Widow Coman, one of the Coggeshall Witches who was targeted relatively late in 1699, and how witchcraft accusations changed to suit the times. Enjoy. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Hello and welcome to Fabulous Folklore. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you, Icy.
Excellent. Obviously, this month we've been looking at both Cunning Folk and Witches, and obviously I've had some very excellent experts on to help. And then where you're concerned, you're going to help me with both of those things. And I wanted to start with Margery Jourdemayne because she was actually the first person where I heard you talk about her. It was I want to say it was one of the folklore podcast witches lectures, I think, years and years ago now. And I mentioned that only briefly in an episode on royal witches, but I do think that because of what happened to her, she deserves a bit more airtime. And obviously, you're the expert. So, for anyone who doesn't know, who was Margery Jourdemayne?
She was a very interesting woman because she ended up being burnt for heresy, which is very, very unusual in England, in 1441. And I think that she sheds a light on the way that, first of all, the social class is mixed, but also the kind of the background, the legal background to heresy and witchcraft, and what cunning folk got up to, the fact that she appears to have been really quite upwardly mobile.
So, was she then, would you say, more a cunning person than a witch, even though obviously the being burnt bit kind of seems to confuse people a little bit on that one?
Yeah, that's because the law changed. Really, England was never too hard on its witches, apart from the occasional outbreak that was normally the result of some person with a bee in their bonnet, a specific person. Marjorie Jourdemayne was deeply unfortunate in that she she was burnt under a law that had only been brought in 1401 as a quid pro quo by the new king who had got rid of the old king. So this was a sort of paying off Archbishop Arundel, I think it was, who was very keen on witch hunting, and this was point at which the law was transitioning from heresy to witchcraft. There would have been no witchcraft laws if there hadn't been the the foundations laid from anti-heresy laws in the centuries prior to that. And she was a cunning woman, but she dealt with the upper classes, really, with the highest in the land. And this was why she interested me so much, because you would think that cunning women and cunning men were doing low magic and were dealing strictly at village level. And then magicians would be usually clergymen who were working at a strictly high level, doing astrology and numerology and necromancy and things like that. But it turns out that socially, these people, she's an example of how these people were actually mixing with each other. So these two separate strands of magic weren't so totally separate at the time.
So, when it comes to people who actually hired people like Marjorie, do you think that there would have been people who kind of kept their services almost like a retainer, or do you think people would have worked with them on more of an as and when kind of basis?
It's very hard to say. Marjorie was charged with three other people, and they were very upper class. They were all clergymen, as you were, chances are, if you were educated in those days. And they worked in the household of Sir Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. And basically, if the king died, Sir Humphrey was the king. So Sir Humphrey was a very, very important bloke, and he had these educated, capable people in his household. Now, his wife, Eleanor, was the one who hired Margery. So there were sort of upper class and lower class people being hired by people like this. And I don't know, Margery would probably have been employed on a more of an ad hoc basis. She wasn't part of the household the way that they were. But she had been arrested and held for witchcraft related charges 10 years prior to that. So she was doing this for a long time, and she was probably mixing with the upper classes for a long time. So she was making a regular living, whether she was retained permanently or on an ad hoc basis. This was her profession.
It's funny because in a way I sort of feel like if you were being employed by the upper classes, you almost feel like that would give you a degree of protection from the authorities, I guess. But in Margery's case, that absolutely didn't happen, did it?
No, you'd think so, wouldn't you? In fact, being caught for heresy or for witchcraft really changed in relation to social class over the centuries. As I said, witchcraft law emerged from anti-heresy law, and certainly, and that kind of started 12th century-ish kind of thing. And it was helped by the establishment of the Dominicans, and it was helped by the urge of the papacy to centralize power. So there was this kind of tension, this dynamic between local Catholic authorities and the Dominicans who would come in. And the idea was that if you managed to get someone by an inquisitorial process, then all of their goods would be split between the inquisitors and between the local lords. So there was a great deal of motivation. I mean, it was absolutely classic perverse motivations to just go after people with money, because it was a very profitable business. And there were places in the Holy Roman Empire where they just ripped through all of the people with money. Far later on, when we're getting to the 16th and 17th centuries, you're looking at people who were underprivileged. The impetus for accusing them of witchcraft was very, very different. But by the time of Margery Jourdemayne's trial, it was very useful as a political accusation. There are a lot of attempts to politically get at people via this kind of way. I mean, things like Joan of Arc, for example, this was political between the French and the Burgundians and English, because France wasn't acting as one sort of a nation at the time. And she was in 1431. She was got politically under a heresy charge. So you could try, if you had an enemy and you needed to get at them politically, and people did need to get at Duke Humphrey because he was trying to prolong a war in France, then they managed to get at his wife. So yeah, heresy and witchcraft were useful politically at that point in history.
Yeah. So what exactly would Eleanor have hired Margery for, do you think?
We're not sure. There are two theories. They found a little wax model, and this was allegedly made by Margery. And so it could well have been either that Margery was colluding with the other three clergymen that were trying to foretell the king's astronomical chart to see whether or not he was going to drop dead, because if he dropped dead, obviously Duke Humphrey was the king, so that would have made Eleanor a very important lady indeed. So she could have been involved with stuff like that, or she might have just known them and have been running a parallel business for things like a more conventional cunning woman's business. Eleanor was around about 40 and she hadn't had any children that we know of. She may well have had an illegitimate child earlier by Duke Humphrey, but we're not sure. It was unusual for a woman not to have children at that point. She'd been married for a good long time. And so the idea that this wax image would be made as an attempt for her to be fertile and have a baby with Duke Humphrey, that's plausible too.
Yeah, you do sort of feel like, I guess in those days it was your role to help prolong a dynasty, but I guess it would also help shore up your position. And obviously we see this with Henry VIII's attempt to found a dynasty, that you would probably be more likely to actually want to have kids than make sure that your husband's the king, because I know I've read a little bit about them and they sound like they've got a really lovely artisanal, intellectual like community around them.
Yeah, court. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, and the other unusual thing about this is that they actually liked each other too. She was, she was a slightly lower class than he was, and they married each other because they liked each other. He had one earlier marriage to a lady called Jacqueline of Hainault, which was a very strategic marriage, and the marriage was ended, annulled, and he was a it was a strategic thing. He may well have been carrying on with Eleanor prior to that because he married her very quickly after his annulment. So they were happy with each other. People wonder if there was some kind of moral overtone to this, because if your marriage wasn't blessed with children, people would wonder if there was something wrong with you, if God was withholding a blessing. So there are several reasons why she could have wanted children.
Hmm. So I'm guessing then Eleanor probably escaped the death penalty because of her status, but obviously that didn't work in Margery's case. So what happened to Margery and the three clergymen? Because we shouldn't forget them either.
Oh no. Well, Eleanor was that there were at that time the legal system isn't the same as it is now. There were church courts and there were secular courts, and secular courts tried things like treason, robbery, and stuff like that. And the secular charges were withdrawn from Eleanor, so she was just tried on heresy. So that would have been tried in a church court, and it was her first occurrence of that charge. So because she was upper class, then yes, she was given a decent retirement. Her marriage was annulled because they said that she had managed to snare Duke Humphrey with the means of magic as well. But with Margery, it was more difficult because she was very, very explicitly on her second go. She had been kind of bailed before in order to, on her own recognizance, to behave well, with a very, very large sum, actually, £20, which was huge. So this also means that she was making enough money. Her husband was one of the people who came up with the money. So this was a family business. I mean, he rated what she did and was helping her out of trouble. So the fact that she had been got for the second time, I think that was probably what meant that she really had no way out of this. The three other guys who were with her, there was Roger Bolingbroke, who was Eleanor's clerk. He was hung, drawn, and quartered, so he didn't get away with it at all. He had a very bad time. Thomas Southwell, they euphemistically said that he died of sorrow in prison, but he was a physician. He may have been able to get hold of poison and killed himself the day before he would have been executed. And the guy who had the highest social status, John Home, he was pardoned because he allegedly only knew about it rather than was actually involved.
Just out of curiosity, other than potentially using astrology to like predict the death of the king, why would somebody have an astrologer as part of the household? Like, what would they actually be looking at charts for? Would it be like in a predictive sense, or would it be in more of a, I'm guessing like a consulting sense? I'm so big when I look at how people use astrology now, I'm always like, what were they using it for then?
Well, it was kosher science in those days, a perfectly respectable science, and people would try to, assuming they went with it, not everybody did, people would use it for influences and good times to do things. I think people were at that point they were trying to work out the physics of the world. And they knew astronomy definitely did. I mean, we now have split it into astronomy and astrology, but at that time they didn't do that. They really felt that these bodies did have an effect on their lives other than just tides and things like that. So I think it would not be an astrologer by themselves usually. It would be somebody who had that as a string to their intellectual bow, and it was a respectable string.
It's funny because I remember coming across, I can't remember his name, but he was a clergyman, I think in Durham, who used to actually make like astronomical almanacs and sort of make predictions like at the table in the church. And I just find that like absolutely wild, the idea that this clergyman could get away with essentially resorting to astrology, but in a church, and everyone was just kind of like, "Oh, you're doing it again." And I just absolutely love that kind of almost like tolerating it as like this particular quirk of this particular clergyman.
Yeah. Well, it depends on the era and depends where you did it.
Mm.
And as I say, astrology was a respectable science. It's just that it's like it's like ballistics now. You could use ballistics to, I don't know, throw fertilizer all over a field, or you could use it to design a gun and shoot someone in the head. So it's what you're doing with it that really takes you over the line. And people would study all sorts of things in universities, but it would be whether or not you were telling everybody, and it would be what you were trying to do with it. There was a guy called, for example, called Cecco who was executed for preaching. I think that he, he was preaching about astrology. He'd actually managed to create an astrological chart of Christ's birth as well. So he was both putting all of that information out there. He was publicizing information which was potentially magically useful. And also, a bit like Galileo, he was his own worst enemy because he was just a twerp. I mean, he was completely unpleasant. You read about him, he seems like a sort of an egotistical narcissist. And so quite often I think if you weren't in the middle of a heresy hunt or a witch hunt, you could quite often get away with an awful lot of theoretical stuff amongst theoretical people in universities. But just don't talk to the peasants.
So I'm guessing if like the ordinary people then found out that, say, someone in the upper class was consulting an astrologer, nobody would bat an eyelid about that.
Nobody would think particularly too much about it. It depends on whether or not you were gunning for them. I mean, Duke Humphrey had all sorts of books. He liked collecting strange books, and he was interested in strange things. And this was the beginning of the philosophy of science. In the 12th century, the Crusades had started off a lot of communication between Eastern and Western Europe. And Western Europe was getting to the point where economically and demographically, it could, again, after the fall of the Roman Empire, afford whole educated classes. And there was a bit of extra money to go around. And then reconnecting with the Byzantine and Arabic empires meant that they could follow up sort of Arabic influenced science, the use of Arabic numerals, which are very important because you can't do you can't do maths with Roman numerals. And so all of this cultural stuff was coming back, and over the course of the next couple of centuries, it really, really stimulated people's intellectual appetite. But there was a snobbish belief that you didn't want to put all of this power in the hands of the peasants, and they yet had to differentiate between the stuff that was mystical, that was kind of random and dealing with supernatural elements that you're trying to evoke, and the stuff that was purely methodical. So we all know that there's mysterious stuff in the world, like lightning, for example. But is lightning a demon, or is it something that you can harness, which power is incredibly methodical? And so they were trying to tell the difference between those two things. And if you were gunning for somebody, if you wanted to get at them politically, you could muddy those waters and try to make it look as though they were evoking Satan for their own benefit.
Hmm. Just as a thought experiment, how do you think people would react now if news came out that a member of the royal family was working with like astrologers or consultant psychics, or would it depend which member of the royal family it was?
Well, I don't think people would be surprised at all because Prince Charles King Charles now has backed homeopathy. I mean, it's mad. I am friends with a guy called Professor Edzard Ernst who who's got very sound scientific credentials, did experiments on whether or not homeopathy worked. He was German. It's very popular treatment in Germany, and he started off thinking that it did, and did the double-blind, placebo-controlled, all the experiments, and he kind of found that his job and his department sort of disappeared after a call from the Duchy of Cornwall. So we know that people in the royal family do come up with some pretty weird ideas, and we're also sort of prepared to use their clout to promote them.
Yeah, I did think when I was thinking about that, it's like, would it depend which member it was? Because I think if it came out that, say, I don't know, Megan had been consulting a psychic, everyone would have a pile on because it would just be
Yeah.
another excuse. Whereas if it was Kate, everyone would probably find a way to explain it away as perfectly, like, oh, this is totally, I suppose it is quite totally normal in some areas. But yeah,
Yeah.
I just think it's quite funny the way that some people still put the royal family on a bit of a pedestal.
Oh, absolutely. And I guess that means it's just as it was in the 15th century. It depends whether someone's gunning for you as to whether or not they laugh at your choice of prognostication or, your way of living. I mean, Princess Diana consulted psychics, didn't she?
I'd forgotten that.
Yeah, yeah. So, and nobody really, they might have thought she was a little bit soft, but they weren't cruel to her for it because she was very popular.
Mm. Yeah, that's one of those things as well where it almost kind of feels a little bit almost harmless in a way
Yeah.
because you can still choose what you do with the information that you're given, I guess, which is the interesting side of it.
It depends on whether or not your subject is the subject du jour as well, because nobody these days would think that it was neutral to go for exorcising demons, and that was very fashionable at one point. Whereas, we've all been to a psychic, so it's just, it's harmless because everybody does it.
Yeah, yeah. Like that's the thing that if you suddenly found out that, I don't know, Camilla read tarot cards or something, and I can absolutely see her doing that, you'll be like, oh, well, who doesn't?
Yeah.
That would be quite cool. I wonder if I'm going to get a call off the palace when this one goes out. If I suddenly disappear, you know why. In terms of Marjorie, then, and this is a really difficult question to answer, I think, but if she hadn't had that first offence, do you think that she might have kind of gotten away with a lesser sentence, or was it just they were so desperate to get at Humphrey that she kind of ends up paying the price for that, regardless of whether she'd done it before or not?
I really don't know. I think there was a way in which their hands were bound because she was bound over to keep the peace, and they wouldn't have cared. I mean, it isn't like anybody would have thought, "Oh, I wonder if we can let this poor old woman off." She wasn't old, by the way; she was about 40. So I think their hands were tied. She might have got away with it. Really, what they wanted to do was to discredit Duke Humphrey and to discredit his wife, and they managed to do that without executing Margery Jourdemayne.
Mm. Because was there some, yeah, there was some discussion at one point that Eleanor had used magic to ensnare Duke Humphrey, and that's the thing that always fascinates me with some of the love magic stuff, the fact that you absolutely couldn't use it to influence another person because then it was interfering with their consent to be married, as it were. And you kind of go, so even in that era, people understood consent perhaps
Yes,
better than they do now.
that's a really good point. Yeah, yeah,
That's sad that we've gone backwards.
yeah.
So from one end of the magical spectrum, I guess, to the other, we can then take a look at the Coggeshall Witches as a different, I suppose, alternative to Cunning Folk, I guess. So obviously, I know that there's multiple witch trials that happen in Coggeshall, but how would you describe the various Coggeshall witches for listeners?
The one that I studied in particular was a woman called Widow Coman, and I was interested in her because I thought that she was a kind of perfect example of a standard kind of, vernacular village level witch in the 16th and 17th centuries, in that she was an ordinary woman. So when we don't have the Inquisition coming in trying to nick all of your stuff now, and her husband died fairly recently. So the fact that the whole village turned around so quickly against her, I think probably means that they either blamed her for his death or that they didn't like her all along and he protected her. But certainly it was a real, it was kind of like a real gang jump on after he died. And the social dynamics were interesting to me.
So that's all in 1699, isn't it? Which feels quite late.
It is late, but people continued to believe in witchcraft for a very, very long time. By 1735, the law had changed to the point where the legal authorities didn't believe in the reality of witchcraft anymore. So you couldn't accuse someone of witchcraft because it didn't exist, which is funny enough, going back to the kind of, ninth century approach to it. and it was wrong to accuse somebody of it because it didn't exist. But at a local vernacular kind of a level, people continued to believe into the 20th century. So I think when you're dealing with these local dynamics, you can't just assume that they were keeping up with whatever the latest fashions were of the educated people.
Mm-hmm. So what actually happened to Widow Coman then?
Well, her husband died, and then she just started to be accused of witchcraft. She was dunked in the river. You can still go and see the river and the bridge. It's still the same bridge now. And the idea was that if you floated, then you were a witch. And if you drowned, you weren't a witch. So you either drowned as an innocent person or floated as somebody who was going to meet their end. And they did this a couple of times. On the second occasion, she ended up not drowning, but it was in December. It must have been absolutely bitter. And she ended up getting ill and dying. But the account that we have from her was written by the local vicar, illustrates the fact that she was kind of constantly harassed. He went in to speak to her, and her thinking and her speaking appears to have been incredibly disordered. And I think we can read a couple of things into that. I think either she was just trying to make no sense so that she could get everybody to just leave her alone, or she was actually suffering a breakdown of some variety or other, and in which case was not fit for looking after herself. Whenever the guy goes in and he talks about when he spoke to her, that she's surrounded by lots of neighbours, so she can't even live in peace in her own home. So she's surrounded by this potentially hostile crowd. And there was at one point when some of her possessions were even taken by her family. There were some pillowcases and a silver bodkin, which must have been worth some money. So people were distributing her goods and chattels amongst themselves before she was even dead. So she was being harassed. I mean, they had already decided what she was guilty of, and were harassing her to death, frankly.
Do you think that part of it might also be because there had been so many witch trials in the same place earlier, or does that give us an indication what that kind of community might have leaned towards, I guess? Or do you think it was just, again, one of those things where it's an easy way to get rid of someone that you don't like in that particular era?
By that era, that was definitely what witch trials were. They were, the economics had changed a great deal. And what you see an awful lot of the time is that when somebody's poor, then it's your job as a good Christian to support them and help them. But of course, if you've got someone who's always poor, then they become a drain on your resources. And so sometimes we see, like with the Lancashire witches, for example, some of them they were incredibly poor. I mean, to be accused of being powerful and in league with Satan was just ridiculous. But it's a way of getting rid of someone within your community who's taking from it without contributing, without you feeling guilty. You can say, no, it isn't that I have to give some of my stuff to them, it's that they're a witch, so I should get rid of them. And you're quite right to point out that this part of the country did have that kind of consciousness. So it's kind of like the rules of thumb, the heuristics that you reach for in that part of the country would have included witchcraft. It also included a lot of early heresy, because facing the continent as it did, there were always a lot of trade relations between the Low Countries, Belgium and Holland, north of France and things like that, with Essex and all of East Anglia. So, and it's flat land, so it's good communications, fairly centralized habitations, cities, towns, things like that. So you could transmit ideas very easily. And it's where Puritans came from. So you've got that religious kind of background going on there. And those were where the Puritans of North America, who were responsible for the Salem witch trials, had come from as well. So, yeah, I mean, I absolutely think that its history and its layout meant that this place had a certain kind of an approach to things, and it would dictate the kind of heuristics that people just reached for.
Is it also Matthew Hopkins' territory, even though I don't think he's actually involved specifically in that town, but that's the sort of general part of the world where he's from, isn't it?
It absolutely is, yeah. Matthew Hopkins and John Stern chased after Essex witches, and it is the same kind of part of town, really. Coggeshall is in the very, very north of Essex, but it is still in Essex. And Hopkins and Stern got away with what they did because they did it during the English Civil War. I think it was 1645. So it was regular, normal law had broken down, and they were able to go in freelance and get away with a great deal of destruction, which they wouldn't have been able to under normal circumstances. They really do represent an unusual blip in English witch trials. And in fact, there's another man called Roger Nowell who is responsible for the unusual blip of the Lancashire witch trials too. Normally, when you do get this sort of large group, it's normally from the enthusiasm of, one nutter.
Yeah. I know we had that problem with the Newcastle witch trials, that it felt very much just in the aftermath of the Civil War. So obviously everyone's still trying to get over like the collective trauma. And
Yes.
when someone then comes along and goes, oh, well, you can now make money out of accusing your neighbours, and they were offering to pay people for making accusations and things. And I guess if you've just been through a financially difficult period, not that I'm excusing them, but you can sort of see
Yeah.
why someone might go, that's a good idea.
Also, that there was just, I think, really studying heresy and studying witch trials is a very good argument against dynamic tension with different estates of power. Because if you come in with one body that has too much, then they can get away with an awful lot before they're corrected. And that is what we see in these Civil War or post-Civil War situations, is that the normal secular courts or even the normal church courts just aren't functioning as they normally should against somebody enthusiastic who comes in and decides they're going to run things.
Hmm. So do you think even after Widow Coman, and again, this is difficult to know, but do you think even after that there would have still been a similar intention around potential witches, or do you think that people would eventually just slowly not lose interest, but kind of pick up new ideas that might make it further down the list of things that you would use to accuse someone of?
I think that you would know that you wouldn't get much support from outside if you accuse someone of witchcraft in 1890 or 1920, but I'm sure there were some people who still believed in it. There were a few things which helped this to subside. First of all was the top-down pressure of the 1735 Act, knowing that you couldn't get the local educated people to pay any attention to it. Second of all was the social dynamic changing, because one of the things you see in witch trials is that people were stuck together in a way that we aren't. It's hard for us, but if you really, really can't stand your friends and family and neighbours, you can move. You just move to a new town, move to a new job. It's just normal. People didn't do that. So quite often you saw a witch trial would be the culmination of sometimes decades of absolute loathing and hate. So now perhaps you don't get those social tensions. There's also communications. As soon as you start getting trains and things like that, then you just have easier access to other ideas and to other people coming into wherever you are. Literacy. I mean, schools starting to teach literacy to children under the age of 12 in the late Victorian era onwards. All of these things just gather gradually to the point where there's less need for scapegoating, which is ultimately witchcraft is that's what it is. It's scapegoating. It's purging all of your feelings of frustration and misery on one person. And it can be a tremendous social kind of release of tension for a short period of time. So if you look for fewer reasons to have to scapegoat people, economic stability is another one of those things too.
I was just thinking, when you consider the mass migration that you have from the country to the towns, when you then get the likes of the Industrial Revolution,
Yeah.
those people would be taking the country ideas, which might include witches with them, but when they're working like 18-hour days and so on, they probably don't really have time to worry about witches. So I suppose there would
Yeah,
also be that, how much of a luxury do you have of having the time to sit and simmer at someone compared to actually I've got to earn a living?
there is that. Yeah, as well. Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, it's funny what you're saying about people being packed cheek by jowl, because I remember years ago, I was in the New York subway once, and we could barely move, we could barely breathe. I mean, it was, rush hour. And I remember thinking at the time, this might be the most civilized place I've ever been in my life, because everybody's so close to each other and nobody's killed anybody. And it's kind of that ability to live so close to each other and to have manners, literally. I mean, it's manners and formal ways of behaving with people that stop you getting angry and just lashing out is incredible.
Mm. I think one of the things that always makes me think about like the witch trials is when you look at things like Facebook community groups and how people are always kicking off in them about the weirdest stuff. And I often wonder, there's a particular woman in our community group, she would 100% be accusing everybody of witchcraft. And so do you think that contemporary neighborhoods could ever be as susceptible to these kind of panics? Or do you think that who neighborhoods would lash out at has changed?
I think we are absolutely the same animals and we are absolutely as susceptible. We probably wouldn't couch it in terms of witchcraft because we wouldn't get taken seriously. But the idea of the sort of group dynamics, finding a scapegoat and throwing all of their ire onto one person, I think we absolutely are still prone to that. And that's a good reason to keep people well fed and reasonably happy. I don't know if you remember, but at the beginning of COVID, there was a news section where this woman outside her cake shop, because everyone was supposed to stay 6 feet apart, she put chalk lines 6 feet apart so that people could see what the distance was. And a special constable came along and he was absolutely screaming at her. I mean, it was uncomfortable to watch. It was a chalk line. She hadn't defaced the pavement at all. But he had special powers and it was a special time. And his own little fascist had just leapt out of his head. It was just there. It was ready. And you're thinking, there must be loads of people like that just waiting for the opportunity. And so I think those witch hunt dynamics are within us all. And it's probably best to make sure our societies are set up such that they're not tripped off.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about all the riots that were had last summer and how quickly they were triggered by people
Mm,
sharing misinformation and blaming a group of people who had absolutely nothing to do with it, and how very quickly that's been diffused more
yeah.
recently. And you do sort of think like, people like to think that we're so much more advanced than people in the 16th, 17th century, whatever. Like, we are basically just giant monkeys connected to the internet. Like, that's probably not a good combination.
Yeah, I think you have to put that. I think you have to put that on social media. That's a perfect way of putting it. I might quote you on that. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. We're the same animals, and we have to be, as well as just restraining ourselves. I think it's probably a good idea to put some energy into just the situations that we find ourselves in, so that it doesn't all kick off.
Absolutely. And obviously, the other thing I wanted to ask is you're the editor of The Skeptic, and you're often on side of Team Skeptic on the Uncanny podcast. And I'm awkward because I kind of flow back and forward between Team Skeptic and Team Believer, or like Team in the middle. So, what actually got you interested in witchcraft as a subject, and why do you think it continues to hold such fascination for people?
I think when I was a kid, it just seemed very mysterious and it seemed very thrilling as well. I mean, there are all sorts of programs on the TV which were scary. There's an X channel called Scarred for Life where they just go through all of this telly from that era, and it's it's fantastic. It's just absolutely thrilling. So I think it's the power and the interest, and it didn't stop for me. But then if you just carry on reading, you realize, well, actually, this stuff's kind of serious because it involves history and anthropology and sociology and economics, and it involves some really, really serious stuff that is well worth studying. So I don't know why it's just always been within me. And even if I didn't have any channel for it, speaking to you today or speaking on Uncanny, I would still be in a dark room in my own house reading books about witches. This is just, I'm very, very lucky because I have this passion in my life. And I'm very, very glad I've got it. I'm very glad it won't go away because it gets you up in the morning. It really does.
Mm. It's interesting that you say about reading books about it, because obviously I know I've talked to other guests and we've all been decrying the Instagram memes, which are not based on any fact or evidence or anything. do you think that that is something that's perhaps missing from a lot of the discourse about witchcraft and witches? The fact that people are getting their information from social media rather than people who've actually looked through archives and the trial records and things like that.
Yeah, I think it's desperately unfortunate that people are using the same word because it is an incredibly different concept. They got a bit muddied in the 1920s with Margaret Murray doing her saying that the witches were original pagans who were sort of like living through Christian Europe, because there's no evidence for that really. But it was a very fashionable idea at the time, and it helped with neo-paganism and with Wicca. And I have no objection whatsoever to people inventing their own religions. I mean, they all needed to be invented at some point. It's absolutely no problem. But to kind of it confuses what is a sound historical subject, and a lot of people really, really suffered. So I just think it's a very, very different kind of a concept.
Yeah, I think that's they can almost run parallel, but they don't necessarily like don't cross the streams, as it were.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And also, is there are differences between sort of religions and magical traditions and magic and superstition, and you know these things are different. And so to try and pretend that there is kind of just one body of knowledge is, well, it's misrepresentation of what's gone on in history, really.
Yeah. So the solution is read about everything. It's interesting.
Yes, yes, yeah. Read a book. Stay off Instagram. Stay off Instagram. You look at Instagram for the puppies.
Yeah, oh that's my favorite part about Instagram, I must admit. It's often full of like anger and bile, and then they'll just be like an otter's learned how to like use a phone or something, and it's the
Yeah.
cutest thing you'll see all day. So what are you working on at the moment? Because you're always fantastically busy, and where can people find you online?
Oh, well, I am online at deborahhyde.com, and you can find the links to my various social media from there. It's Deborah Hyde Folklore on YouTube. I've just finished a series of videos about the Green Children of Woolpit, which was a couple of potentially fairy children turning up in the 12th century in East Anglia. And I'll be doing another one later on this year, which will involve a cauldron.
Nice.
Yeah. I'll be talking at Humanists UK convention between the 13th and the 15th of June. And I'll be talking about the legal path from heresy to witchcraft. So that will be interesting to anyone who has listened to this podcast. What else am I doing? Oh, I'm doing loads of stuff. I'm doing a guest episode for American podcast Skeptoid. Yeah, there's not much time to stop and take a break. I owe a lot of writing to various people. So yeah, busy times.
So, but people can come and check out what you're doing, and I recommend subscribing to your YouTube channel, which I can actually link to from the YouTube video version of this episode, so that'll make that easier.
Fantastic.
You've got to go clicky clicky, and that's always good. But it's been absolutely marvelous speaking to you, and I hope people go and check out your work.
Great to talk to you as well, Icy. See you soon.
Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.